Good evening, and let me welcome you to the third public session held by the Parliamentary Reform Commission. And first, let me acknowledge the presence of His Honour, Senator Reginald Farley, President of the Senate of Barbados, and the presence of Sir Richard Cheltenham and Lady Cheltenham. Sir Richard, as you know, is the chairman of the Parliamentary Reform Commission. In attendance are other commissioners, including Sir Roy Trotman, Her Excellency Ambassador Elizabeth Thompson, Mr. Corey Beckles, and Dr. William Chandler. Mr. Pedro Eastman is also the Secretary to the Commission, and I am the final Commissioner, Maxine McLean. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen in the audience here at Princess Margaret Secondary School, and those who have joined us virtually, your presence is very important to this exercise. This third public session is intended to look at the terms and conditions of service and pensions of parliamentarians. As we can appreciate, any examination of the parliamentary system has of necessity to address this critical component of the system, and that is the individuals who make up the Parliament of Barbados, that is the House of Assembly and the Senate. With us this evening to facilitate our efforts to discuss this issue and solicit your contributions, your thoughts and suggestions are three former parliamentarians, Mr. Rudolph Cappy Greenwich, Mr. Stephen Lashley, and Sir Roy Trotman, of course, who's also well known as a labour expert and will be speaking to us in that context, particularly this evening. We will begin, however, with a presentation from Dr. William Chandler, and included in tonight's presentations are videotaped comments from Mr. Peter Wickham, who could not be here with us in person. Let me again thank all of you distinguished members of the audience, both here and with us, who are with us in person, and those individuals who are following this evening's proceedings online. I also welcome any journalists who are here to cover this evening's session. I will therefore now ask Dr. Chandler to start the evening's presentations by sharing with us some introductory remarks. Over to you, Dr. Chandler.
Thank you, Chair. Good night, everyone. Good night as well to former ambassadors who are in the audience. The Parliamentary Reform Commission is extremely excited to be engaging the public in a series of town halls on parliamentary reform. Parliamentary reform, at the end of the day, is geared towards making sure that the business of Parliament as an institution and the business of government impacts people's lives for the better on a daily basis. Parliament is a place in this country with the greatest concentration of democracy. It is a place where our representatives meet, they devise policy, they pass policy in various measures, primarily laws, and those laws are then implemented for our benefit. Many people have many ideas about what Parliament should be and what the parliamentary system should be doing on a daily basis. These town halls are meant to gather ideas, distill what should be used and what should not be used, what should be retained, what should be reformed, and make sure that we have the best system that can work for the majority. Hopefully, that can work for all. All ideas do contend. Along the way in our process, people have asked us a question: will our ideas actually be taken on? Will we be taken seriously? The answer is an emphatic yes. I think the presence of all those on this commission should show you that. Everyone on this commission takes parliamentary reform seriously. We take the parliamentary system of government seriously. And to the extent that Barbados has expressed its desire to move from a dominion, independent dominion, to a full self-ruling, self-determining republic, we as a people need to make sure that the institution with the greatest concentration of democracy reflects us in its entirety. So, while there are various forms of reform going on in Barbados, parliamentary reform is supposed to be that special case where we make sure that those we elect and those we appoint and those who represent us are tooled to the best of our ability, are financed to the best of our ability, secured to the best of our ability, reflect us to the best of our ability. Why do we say our ability? Because at the end of the day, the Parliament of Barbados is ours. And if we want the Parliament of Barbados to reflect us, we have to engage in the process. It does not make sense staying home and grumbling to yourself when you have the opportunity to say something. And if you want to say something, and if you want your voice to be heard, then you can come and speak with the Parliamentary Reform Commission. You can write to us. You can send us emails. Our office is at the Parliament of Barbados. The Clerk of Parliament is Secretary to the Commission. It is easy access. You can come any day. You can access us. You can call the Parliament's office. The email will be given to you later on. You have every opportunity to participate in the process and have your voice heard. Ideas have already been sent to us. Full-blown presentations have been sent to us. One-worded questions have been sent to us. We've been replying. Everything that every person says is being discussed. And what we want to convey to you at all times is that this is a democratic process. It is a process that involves the people of Barbados in a conversation that is a fellowship of public life. It is engineered for you to be able to give of your best in this process. So what does that mean? It means looking at yourself and thinking for yourself and your children and generations to come what you want Barbados to look like, and coming in whatever form, whether it's by email, call, coming in person, interacting with us via Zoom, putting a question or a suggestion in the chat online. What you want for Barbados, what you want for the Parliament of Barbados. All sorts of categories are on the table. The electoral system is on the table. Last town hall, we heard from those who wanted an elected president, elected prime minister, a change to proportional representation. We've heard about national seats. We've heard about constituencies being changed in different ways to reflect different sectors of society. We've heard from those with who are disabled. We've heard from those who have special interests. We are hearing from you tonight. And we're hoping that in all of this, we come to a better understanding about what the consensus is in this country and how we can move forward as one stable people under a parliament that reflects our Republican values, which we are working out together. So I'm hoping that tonight, as we listen to the speakers and we listen to the presentations, we will do so in harmony to make sure that whatever is produced is of the best quality. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chandler. And I believe that in his introductory comments, he shared with us the purpose of the commission, the process, and indeed the outcomes that we are anticipating. And now I will invite one of our several guests, Mr. Rudolph Cappy-Greenidge, to share with us his thoughts on the role and function of parliamentarians.
Thank you very much. And I want to begin my short presentation by saying that it was about 1956 or so. I remember very distinctly a young schoolboy asked his father, "Daddy, what it is that Winter Crawford and Dee Garner do after they win their seats?" And the father replied to the son and said, "They talk in the House of Assembly and they try to get good roads for the people." And he stopped at that. And that is as crisp as I could put it. And that is no lie, because I was that schoolboy. And I have to tell you today that Barbadians are expecting more and more from their MPs. the demands are a lot greater than ever before. Not simply talking in the House of Assembly and getting roads for the people. Nowadays, the perceived duties of an MP are not lessening. They are going up, they are increasing. And the duties are open-ended. There is no cutoff point whatsoever. You see, there is nothing black and white saying what an MP's duties are. There is no job description. Nowadays, a good MP to some people is not the one who provides the roads, the plane facilities, and the street lights. They judge MPs by different criteria. And speaking of what an MP is supposed to do, I am home. My house is just a few yards away from the bus stop. And this particular morning, I can hear this lady to the top of her voice, Ian Danny ain't doing nothing about it. And what was it? She was at the bus stop. There's an ant's nest at the bus stop. And she's jumping from left to right. And she came to me and said, Mr. Greenwich, the ant's nest out here, everybody getting bite, I ain't doing nothing about it. I didn't say anything, I just tell her, okay, okay, okay. And when she caught the bus and they left, I went to the bus stop, took a can of Baygon that I had in the house, and I sprayed it. Now, do you think that that is one of the jobs that an MP has to do? But they're judging you by it. Whether or not you do it, that is your business, but they are judging you by it. You see, being an MP is a 24-hour, 7 days a week job. You don't got a Sunday off or Saturday off, you know. 7 days a week and 24 hours a day. And we have to let people know that being an MP is not without its hazards. There are hazards to it. A lot of MPs walk around under tremendous stress, believe it or not. People think that an MP gets a lot of money, they save a lot of money, and that they become rich from the money that they get. And nothing is farther from the truth. And we have to remember too that a lot of our members of Parliament, I wouldn't say a lot, but quite a few, of our members of Parliament are not professionals. I was in the House with people like Mark Williams and Hamilton Lashley and those. And they would always tell me, they would always tell you that the inadequate constituency allowance that they get, that went in a flash. Before you could look around, it's gone. And yet people think, oh, they get a lot of money and they put it on the bank and they get rich. That's not true at all. And I do not believe for one moment that people like the same Hammy Lashley and Mark Williams and those, that they were tempted into going into politics because of money, that they were encouraged by that. These are their fellows who honestly like to serve and like to do their part. But the point I'm making is that people are no longer turning to friends and relatives to assist them. They turn to the MP. The MP is what somebody may want to describe as the modern day sugar daddy. Most, yeah, that's a fact, Liz. The MP is called upon to help young mothers with uniforms and with lunch money, and even to help solve a lot of their personal problems. For instance, the fathers not supporting the children, so the MPs are asked to support the child. You don't have money to pay the rent, so the MP is asked to pull his pocket. On top of that, the MP is asked to attend every function, every school fair, every church luncheon, every fundraising activity, every funeral, don't miss those, every funeral. And the MP must help the frail victim to get a house. And the MPs do. But the only point I'm making is that it is no longer about just the roads and talking in the House of Assembly. It's not. That is not all it is. And in most cases, the MP takes on the misfortunes of his constituents as though they were his own misfortunes. Often, he weeps with those who weep. I've seen it. I have seen it. I've done it. And being an MP takes a heavy toll on your family life. Your personal life is put on the back burner. In fact, your personal life is not personal anymore. And of all the requests that they make on you, they must realize at some stage that the MP cannot fulfill every single request. And some requests are very, very unreasonable on the MP. It was only yesterday when I was telling my sister Eleanor that I would have to be here tonight. And she reminded me of a fellow who had come to my house. He had borrowed $30,000 from the bank to buy a house spot. And he had repaid the bank $2,000. And the bank was coming down on him. And he came to my house and he wanted me to pay the bank the $28,000. And then he would pay me back by the month. Now, he wasn't paying the bank. He had only paid $2, but he wants to borrow the $28 from me to pay me by the month. I told him I couldn't do it. He has not spoken to me since. He has not spoken to me since. Some of the requests can be extremely unreasonable. And you know that I used to go to my constituency meetings on Thursdays after cabinet. And some Thursday evenings I saw between 30 and 40 people every time. Between 30 and 40. And there was one young lady. She wanted a schoolmate's job. I was in education. And she wanted a schoolmate's job. At that time, there were no vacancies, none available. And every evening, almost religiously, she would come to the meetings. And you'd always be telling her nothing. But by the way, you know, I was in sports as well. And I have something at the Sports Council, and you can get that. She didn't want it. By the way, somebody told me there's something at the training board you want. She don't want it. She kept that going on for about a year until I got a schoolmate's job for her. Some people told me I shouldn't have got it for her, but I did get it. And I have to tell you that up to today, she's still there. But it just shows you give her this, you give her that, she don't want it, she must have that schoolmate's job. And you know, when they come to the constituency office, they don't want to speak to the personal assistant. They want to speak to the MP, and they will tell you, I didn't vote for the personal assistant. I voted for him, and I want to see him. Some of them can be unreasonable. And you know, I had a list. You have to look for jobs for them. I had a list. I remember at one stage, my list of persons requesting jobs was 126. There's 126 bits of pressure that I am under. 126 people wanting jobs. And I couldn't raise a magic wand to find jobs for all 126. There's a death in the family. You're called upon to take the constituents to the undertaker. And you end up paying part of the burial expenses. You see, as I said, it is a job without boundaries. It is a job without a job description. And all of this has nothing to do with the MP's portfolio. It has absolutely nothing to do with the MP's desk work, you know. And the public doesn't appreciate what the MP has to do besides being an MP. You know, I was trying to get hold of what I could call the Minister of Education. And I called. She was having meetings with parents who wanted transfers for children. A twin, one is going to Combermere, and one passed for St. Michael's and that type of thing. Next day, she's at a site visit. Next day, she's having a meeting with Teachers Union. She's meeting with school meals. She has to go to cabinet. You think that I would ever be so mad as to say, you know, I calling her and I can't get hold of her at all, you can't get, no, that would not be my attitude, because I know what that desk work is. But the public doesn't appreciate it. I trying to get, she and can't get, and that is the attitude of the public, of sub-members of the public. It's not an easy thing. And the other thing is that the public believes that being an MP is a cushy job. You see, that is how it looks from the outside. It looks to them, it seems to them as though it is a cushy job. And there's a total misconception about the so-called perks which an MP gets. Total misconception about it. I know that not far away from Barbados is a place where an MP can get duty-free cars maybe every 2 years. MPs in Barbados get no duty-free concessions. MPs have no medical insurance as MPs. They get no sickness benefits. MPs in Barbados, with 2 exceptions, are not chauffeur-driven. And at the end of it, an MP is only as good as his last favor. I know of an MP who died in the armed services. On another matter, to date, I have only heard of 3 persons screaming from the rooftops that, and this has to do with the pensions, screaming from the rooftops that they are attempting, this is the word, attempting to push the pension age upwards, but parliamentarians like themselves can get their pensions at 50 years old. I've heard about 3 people. And it is such a sexy topic that a lot of other people would chime in and say, I had to wait till I get 67 to get mine. Why should an MP get his at 50? It is enough, yes, to cause you to raise your eyebrows. But the way I answer that question all the time is quite simple. I let them know, take the politics out of this thing about 50 years. This is not a political matter. Because if it was a political matter, you'll have to put both sides in the pot, both. Because we became independent in 1966. The Right Excellent Henry Barrow, he was Prime Minister in 66. And it was in 1969 that this 50-year rule came into being. He was still the Prime Minister. So there's no politics in this. The Prime Minister, our present Prime Minister, has already stated her position, which is, I don't mind if it moves upwards from 50. She's made that public. My personal view is that 50, as an ex-parliamentarian at 50, can get another job. Yes. I think that 50 is a bit generous. I think that 50 is early. I would be comfortable with even 60 years. And I know that there are some parliamentarians who might even say, don't touch it, leave it at 50. Let me say tonight that this is not a big issue. And sometimes I wonder what it is that we're making all this big hoorah about. In any one session of Parliament, how many parliamentarians are under 50 or have just lost their seat at 50? Those who have ever benefited from this rule, this 50-year rule, can be counted on one hand. Believe you me. Those who have benefited from that 50-year rule, we can count on one hand. And that 50-year rule applies to very, very few parliamentarians. Very few of them have ever benefited from that rule. What will happen to that 50-year rule depends on what this particular committee recommends. They may suggest that we push it upwards to 55 or 60 or wherever. If they up it, for me, no problem. If they leave it where it is, for me, still no problem. Not many people benefit from it. So the next time you hear someone say that the MPs get fat from money that the government pays to them, I want you to tell them no. And tell them that you heard the truth from an MP who pulled his own pockets for getting prizes for his own activities. You heard from an MP who used to have a quiz for every single school. All the schools came together, the St. Philip schools. And that MP pulled his pocket to give the prizes to the children. That you heard from an MP who had a ladies' walk, and the first 30 persons in that ladies' walk always got prizes out of his own pocket. That you heard from an MP who had a dominoes tournament, and all of the players, the winners, got prizes out of his own pocket. That you heard from an MP who had a cricket tournament. And let me tell you something about the cricket tournament. He paid, sometimes there were 5 matches being played in the constituency. That's 10 teams. He gave each team 2 balls. He provided the lunch. He paid the umpires. He paid the groundsman to roll the wicket. All out of his pocket. And people would be saying, oh, they just get fat. But as I said, an MP is valued by what he has done for me personally. I'm sad to say once again that an MP is only as good as his last favor. It's a job that can be very thankless. MPs get no sympathy for the sacrifice they make. And I would love to see a change in the public's expectation of an MP. A reality check on how much an MP should be asked to do. I do not know how much change will come about in the next 5 or 10 years. I doubt there will be much change, but I would ask the public to spare a thought for the MP. Before I close, I just want to say that I have been wrestling with a little point for some while, and I think this might be the best forum to bring it up in. It has to do with the role of the Speaker. I believe that the Speaker in our system, don't care if it's Arthur Holder or who, I feel that that Speaker is at a disadvantage. That Speaker has no opportunity to agitate on his constituents' behalf, to show his worth on the floor of Parliament. But remember that he has somebody who is running against him. I recall the election when I thought there was going to be a tie. And it was 15-14 as the count went on in the night. Anthony Wood was the last seat to come in. And instead of it coming home 15-15, it went home 16-14. And I was wondering whether or not, then if you had the tie there, it would have been 15-15. And I believe what would have happened was that the party which would have got the most votes overall would still retain the government. Now you have 15-15. You're asking one of those to be the Speaker. Now look at what has happened. You got 15-14 now on the floor, but in whose favor? I know of systems where the Speaker does not come from the elected parliamentarians. The Speaker comes when the two, or three, or how many parties there are, have decided this independent person that we all have confidence in should be the Speaker. And I think that the time has come when we can use that system. I believe so. We have people in Barbados who will give you fairness. And it is one thing which I've wrestled with for some time, and I just want to bring that to the attention of this particular committee, in addition to the few points which I've made earlier. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And as you heard from Mr. Greenidge, an MP's job is a job without boundaries, a job without a job description. I now ask a fellow MP, I suppose a junior in terms of serving in terms of chronological time, Mr. Stephen Lashley, to share his thoughts on the role and functions of an MP.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. First of all, I want to welcome all of you who are here tonight. I think that this is very important that you are here to be a part of this important exercise, and I'm very happy and certainly to have been one of the invitees, and I want to thank the Commission for asking me to join my colleague, Kathy Greenidge, as I say, in the dock, speaking to what I consider to be a very important national issue. I believe, though, that before we even begin to speak about the role and function of the MP, that we have to address the public education aspect of it. And I think some of this is caught up in what Kathy Greenidge would have addressed. The role and function of a member of parliament should be among those areas that the public is educated about. And I believe that if the public is educated about the role and function of the members of parliament and of parliament, then we will have a greater awareness and perhaps a better expectation from the public about what the MP should be doing. I also believe that this education would benefit what I refer to as aspiring politicians. Because although you only need to win a seat to be in Parliament, I believe that the public has a vested interest in ensuring that we get the right people come into public life and being in Parliament. So, prospective parliamentarians, in my view, need to be targeted in this public education exercise. And I believe that that job should start right now with the work of this commission. I think that within our communities and our schools, we need to start to demystify the role and function of the parliamentarian. And hopefully some of those aspiring parliamentarians will come to understand at a very early stage what is involved. I do agree with most of what Kathy Greenidge would have said, particularly as it relates to the multidimensional role of an MP. MP is, and I won't repeat what he has said except to say that I agree, but the Member of Parliament really has a very multifaceted role. And his role does not only begin and end in what he is required to do in Parliament. I think, first of all, the role of the MP is essentially to represent his constituents. And that's first and foremost. The Member of Parliament, of course, is elected by his constituents, and therefore, by that synergy, that correlation, his first role is to represent the interests of the constituents. And it doesn't matter what the MP becomes, whether he becomes a minister of government, whether he becomes the speaker, the chairman of committees, he is expected to represent the interests of his constituents. And I liken it to the Member of Parliament being everything required that constituents ask for. It's a massive role. And I was only listening recently to what was happening in Jamaica, where I believe it was a recommendation coming out of one of the commissions established very early in Jamaica to look at parliamentary reform, where as a result of the confusion, I believe, relating to the role and function of the Member of Parliament, that they have determined that there should be job descriptions for members of Parliament. And I totally embrace that. I think that's a start. It may not capture everything because you can have a job description, but the expectations of people in terms of what your role is still something that I believe cannot be etched in a job description. But I believe that that's something that should be done. To manage this multifaceted role is extremely onerous. But I believe that preparation for the role is very important. And those members of Parliament who are prepared for the massive job of representing their constituents in and out of Parliament are perhaps better performers, can better appreciate what they're asked to do. I also believe that whether the MP is asked or required to do all the things that Kathy Greenidge has said, and there are many more. There are just some. I think the Member of Parliament is really supposed to be that person who has all the answers. You can't not have an answer for a constituency issue. In my experience, though, where I think we need to focus some of the reform is what resources are provided for the Member of Parliament to execute all of these myriad roles and these duties. And I often reflect on the role of the backbencher, because the backbencher is that person who does not hold a cabinet position. But the role and function of that backbencher is no different from a minister, for example. But yet still, the resources available to both persons are usually different. And I happen to believe that we are expecting, as we should, a great deal from the members of Parliament. The people expect that, as they should. Where I believe we have fallen down and where we need to place more emphasis are the resources made available to the Member of Parliament to execute that task. And I say this within the context that we cannot be continuing at that point where we only have reliance on giveaways and fundraising and even requests to persons who often give of their dollars to help members of Parliament in their constituencies. That has been part and parcel of how members of Parliament survive. And Cappy Greenwich, of course, referred to the allowance which members of Parliament receive, which is quite, I would say, it doesn't last a snow cone. It comes and goes very rapidly because of the significant demands on the Member of Parliament. I also feel that the reform exercise must go in the direction of ensuring or encouraging members of Parliament to annually design constituency development plans, which plans are presented for appropriate funding by the state. I think there is a juncture at which the needs of a constituency can be financed only by donations or, from, as Cappy said, from his own pocket. I think we have gone beyond that. And I think that we need to have a system where members of Parliament can identify budgets, identify their constituency development plans, and have those plans financed by the state. I believe the annual estimates exercise must be one in which parliamentarians can have separate votes in relation to their constituencies. Because to do otherwise, I think, would not be in keeping with where we wish to get to. So the estimates must be one area in which is identified for financing for projects and programs identified by members of Parliament to be implemented. And yes, overseen by members of Parliament under rigid rules of accountability. And we speak a lot nowadays of accountability and ensuring that members of Parliament do not become victims of all kinds of things, temptations. I think the state has a vested interest to ensure that a member of Parliament does not have to go by cap in hand to private or other individuals for money to finance public projects and programs in a constituency. I believe that's a recipe for disaster, and I think that we must be moving beyond that. So I am advocating that we need to have the programs of constituencies properly funded by the state. And this does not in any way rule out what the MP does in relation to either fundraising or if he or she is able to supply their own funds. But we have got to get beyond that particular aspect of it. I did hear Cappy Greenwich refer to the fact that in some countries across the Caribbean, there are members of Parliament who are chauffeur-driven. And I find these are delicate topics because in Barbados, a member of Parliament is not really supposed to enjoy any kind of what we call decent treatment. I recall going to other Caribbean islands, and it's amazing. You're treated better in other Caribbean islands than you're treated in Barbados. I also recall as a minister having to drive your own car to functions and having to jump from your car, and you're the keynote speaker, having to park your car, jump from the car, rush into the podium, and speak, hopefully not losing your breath. And I remember on one occasion, not necessarily being late, but I had some traffic ahead of me, and I was the keynote speaker, and I had to go and find a car park. There was nobody to park your car. And ahead of me, I saw a very plush MP, I think it was a Mercedes, driving one of our judges, who also had to speak at the function, and the judge just alighted from the car, and the car was taken and parked safely while I had to go and park my own car. I said that because the notion in Barbados that members of parliament are not supposed to have access to these things is very much real. And I think that when persons reflect on what members of parliament do, and particularly if you have dual roles, because we're talking about the member of parliament, but a member of parliament can have other roles. You could be, whether you're a minister of government, whether you are the Speaker of the House, chairman of committees, you have multiple roles, and you have to execute all of those roles efficiently and effectively. And before I forget, in terms of the discussion that Capi Guinness raised in relation to the role of the Speaker, I totally agree with that position, except that I will go further. I think we have to get to the point to recognize that Parliament is that organ of the state where members of Parliament are engaged in the business of representing their constituents. And the Speaker, in my view, cannot do so effectively from being in the chair. And I think that not only the Speaker, we have the Deputy Speaker, we also have the chairman of committees who have to be in the chair from time to time. I believe that those positions should be appointed positions. I don't believe that you should have an elected person being the Speaker of the House, an elected person being the chairman of committees, or an elected person being the Deputy Speaker. I think as we seek to enlarge the role of Parliament, this is an opportunity to engage with civil society and have those persons selected under, of course, appropriate rules and how it is dealt with from the wider public. So that's an area of innovation that I think should be there. In reflecting again on the role of the Member of Parliament, I believe the Member of Parliament is really the political leader in his or her constituency. What happens often, though, is I don't think that that role is often respected. I believe we've talked a lot about the right to being consulted. I think the Member of Parliament should be consulted on important developments affecting his or her constituency. And I believe that that right to be consulted should not just be a token right. I think that that right should even be legislated. The role of the MP need to be respected in a much more, I would say, streamlined way. And oftentimes, even while you may be in a particular administration, I'm sure that members of Parliament often would see things happen that impact on their constituency, and they have not been consulted. They don't know. And I think that that is one of the areas that we need to strengthen and implement a system to address it. This commission, of course, is also addressing the question of parliamentary entitlements, whether they be parliamentary increases in salaries, and of course the big buzzword is about pension. And my view on this is, because the danger of, certainly in the past, of how parliamentary salary increases have been addressed, pension, these matters, they're all very sensitive matters, but I think they're even made more sensitive by the persons who are dealing with them. They're made more sensitive by the parliamentarians themselves. And I think the time has come when these issues ought to be totally withdrawn from being decided by a government. They should not be decided by government. Government obviously is required to provide financing in the event that there is a salary increase for members of parliament, in the event that there is need to address issues of pension. These matters should be depoliticized, and they should be vested in an independent body, an independent commission. If there is need for pension reform should not be tweaked at lightly. Salary increases should not be tweaked at lightly, but they should be the subject of careful study and review by professionals who understand and who are aware of various global changes in parliamentary pension and pension rights and salaries. We run the danger of making these matters political issues, particularly when you have the discussion of a parliamentary increase and then somebody says, well, I am not taking it because I am going to donate it to charity. And that is meant to put whoever proposed the salary increase under the public guillotine. We have to remove it completely from that and allow these issues to be the subject of deliberate, independent review and analysis. So if there's need to look at the pension issues, then I think an independent body should look at it, who are informed by proper actuaries and professionals. That should remove some of the sentimentality that I hear about the issues such as pension and salary rights. There is also the issue of parliamentary committees, because the role and function of the parliamentarian is also caught up in his or her involvement in parliamentary committees. By and large, the parliamentary committee that is the sexiest is the Public Accounts Committee. And that committee, of course, during the lifespan of every administration, is often very controversial because of the issues that arise, and perhaps who wants to make issues out of issues. I think the parliamentary committee system needs to be reformed. I believe that there must be avenues for more or greater public involvement in parliamentary committees. And I believe that there should not be a parliamentary committee that does not have public hearings, whether those be in relation to public accounts, whether they relate to matters of privilege, all issues of Parliament that engage the parliamentary committees should be made public. I think the use of the parliamentary committee system is an excellent avenue to allowing for greater public involvement in the work and the business of Parliament. And I think that certainly as we are moving forward in our political agenda in terms of we are now one of the newest republics in the world, we need not confine our gaze when it comes to parliamentary reform only on examples that we read about either online or we wish to adopt from other countries. I think Barbados ought to be bold enough to strike out on its own and engage in systems, devise systems that are relevant to our own experience. Our parliament is the third oldest parliament in the Commonwealth. And we have been hailed historically as being perhaps one of the most mature small democracies in the world. And it says to me that we do not need to confine our gaze only on adopting what other people do. We have to be bold enough to seek to adopt our own models for parliamentary reform. So the parliamentary committees, I believe that they should even function outside of what a government of the day wishes to have. Oftentimes, parliamentary committees are awakened only by the whip of the government. The government believes that this particular matter should be the subject of a particular parliamentary commission, or there should be a commission or committee, there should be a committee to deal with this or that. I believe that certainly within the standing orders of Parliament, that these committees ought to be established, and they ought to function notwithstanding who is in office, notwithstanding the wishes of a government. And I think in doing this, it will enrich the what Parliament means to people, because we have to be cautious or wary of having our Parliament seen as too far away from the public of Barbados. And I come then to what I consider to be another matter that we should engage in. Oftentimes, I believe the average person would see Parliament as that place where other persons raise issues of importance. In other words, the themes of the day, the priorities of the day are literally determined by the government, as they should. But I think that there can be a balance. And I think there ought to be introduced a right bestowed upon the public to petition Parliament on matters of importance, and to petition Parliament for matters to be debated based on a consensus, either by means of some kind of electronic voting process, to ensure that the public can have matters on the agenda of Parliament to be debated. Right, so I got a little note that I need to also come home soon. There are other observations, of course, that I have, but I want to say that before I wind up, I want to say that the reforms that we adopt in our Parliament must first and foremost be aimed not only at enhancing the quality of the contributions of members of Parliament, but they should be aimed at enhancing people's participation in the business of Parliament. And if we do this, I believe that we will be enriching what Parliament currently does, and also we will be doing certainly a tremendous favor for the work that members of Parliament have to carry out on a daily basis. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And before I move to our next item, I would want very much to thank both of you and to ask you, Stephen, if I might call you that, to put in writing your very important recommendations, because I believe that in linking issues such as the role and purpose of committees to the role and function of parliamentarians is an important example of the nature of some of the things we have to consider. So we look forward to receiving a written submission with some expansion of those suggestions and recommendations. And I would want now to go to the floor, and I believe that we would have received a request from Dr. Grenville Phillips Jr. to make a presentation. But before I do that, I made a note of a comment from one of the persons following online who suggested, in response to the illustration used by Mr. Greenidge of trying to reach a minister, that perhaps there needs to be a consideration of the appointment of non-elected persons to cabinet and let MPs function in terms of representing their constituents. So I would want, I think that it was a Mr. Hoyt, to realize that we are following and we are taking note of your comments and suggestions, and we encourage other persons who are following virtually to do so. With that said, I will invite Dr. Phillips to share with us, as he requested some time ago, and he is here with us.
Yes. Right. Oh. Yes, thank you. I'm not going to be nearly as long as those. No worry.
We did give them the guidelines as the time to speak. They stood within the, well, it was probably 21, 22.
I'm not going to be anywhere near that.
Okay.
Okay. All right, so good evening. Thank you for this opportunity to address you. I wrote it down to make sure that I can keep brief. We have four recommendations to make, really. Our first addresses elected members to the House of Assembly. So Barbados' Parliament consists of a House of Assembly with 30 members and a Senate with 21 members. These 51 persons are responsible for passing bills which become laws to govern us. Members of the House and Senate are supposed to read, debate, and vote on the bills on our behalf. We should be reminded of Lord Acton's famous observation: power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. We seem to have either forgotten this, or we have deluded ourselves into thinking that we are somehow immune from this absurd behavior in leaders of other nations. Regardless of our reasons, Barbados' current one-party state makes us all vulnerable to harm. But we are fortunate to have parliamentarians who, so far, appear to have been able to restrain themselves from doing us harm. But despite this admirable quality, we should be under no illusion that the absolute power they have exercised since 2018 will eventually corrupt them absolutely, as it has done to so many others throughout history. Despite this foreseen risk, we cannot always protect people from the choices they make. The people elected their representatives. So our first recommendation is that they should be allowed to continue to do so without any special interest quotas being forced on them. The first past the post system appears to be the fairest method to elect members to the House of Assembly every 5 years. Our lone consolation is that their terms in Parliament are not permanent. So our second recommendation now addresses the opposition. What this recent one-party state experience has taught us is that Barbados' Parliament needs a formal opposition. Our second recommendation is that the House of Assembly should always have a minimum number of 5 opposition seats. So if one party wins all 30 seats in the House, then the 5 willing losing candidates with the highest number of votes in their constituencies should be appointed to the House, not as representing a constituency, but solely as members of an opposition. Therefore, the maximum possible number of members of the House of Assembly is 35. Again, another example, if one party wins, say, 28 seats, then the elected opposition would be 2. Therefore, the 3 losing willing candidates with the highest number of votes in their constituencies should be appointed to the House solely as members of an opposition. In this scenario, the House of Assembly will consist of 33 members, of which 30 were elected as representatives of their constituencies and 3 were appointed as members of an opposition. Since appointed opposition members do not represent constituencies in Parliament, they should not be paid for that component of their responsibilities. This now brings us to our third recommendation, and that is addressed in the Senate. In our Senate, there are currently 12 senators who are appointed by the Prime Minister, 2 by the Leader of the Opposition, and 7 by the President. To give a voice in Parliament to political parties and independent candidates receiving significant votes but not enough to participate in the House of Assembly, we recommend that 15 senators should be selected by proportional representation of the political parties and independent candidates who participated in the general election. The President may then appoint the remaining 6 senators. So our final recommendation addresses the operation of Parliament. As human beings, we are not perfect. Therefore, nothing we create is perfect and everything can be improved, including bills that our parliamentarians pass. To protect us from bad legislation, our parliamentarians are required to read and debate each bill 3 times to reduce the number and magnitude of imperfections in each bill. This critical review appears to be neglected. One example may suffice. To make Barbados a republic required changes to the Constitution of Barbados. The proposed changes were contained in the Constitution Amendment No. 2 Bill 2021. It took me over 50 minutes to read that bill. On the 6th of October 2021, our senators did their second mandatory reading of this bill in 2 minutes and 19 seconds. Our senators then completed their mandatory third reading of this bill in 9 seconds. For comparison, on the 28th of September 2021, our elected members of Parliament completed their mandatory third reading of the most important piece of legislation they will likely ever read in 2 seconds. An irresponsible tradition appears to have developed in our Parliament where second and third readings of bills are seen as unnecessary bureaucratic vestiges of colonialism rather than the proven method of improving bills for our benefit. The corruption of leaders seems to start with the idea that they are infallible. History always proves that they were not, but they continued in their delusion that they were. This deception may explain why our parliamentarians do not read the bills as mandated. Another explanation is that they are just too busy to read them, and we heard some examples of that. Whatever the reason, it is critical that our parliamentarians read the bills on our behalf. To ensure that all parliamentarians do this duty, our final recommendation is that each bill be divided into 30 sections in the House of Assembly and 21 sections in the Senate. Each parliamentarian should then be required to read aloud 1 section of each bill at each reading of the bill. Otherwise, they should not vote on what they have not thrice read. And that concludes my submission. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think I will... There's one issue that you raised, and I am trying best to figure out how to explain it, and I will call on my persons who would have served longer periods of time in Parliament. But the notion of reading a bill, I think that speaks to a process of debate. The critical part of it is the second reading. The first reading speaks to the announcing, and I'll explain it as best as I can, and I call on my colleagues around me to have the matter put before the House or the Senate so that there's notification given. The second reading constitutes the debating of the bill, and part of that involves going into committee where you can dissect the bill and look at it section by section, seeking clarification, etc. So perhaps you may want to explain a little more, but before that, I also want to ask you to share with us your written submission.
Yes.
But maybe you can explain to us again your notion of reading and what exactly required, because I'm a little bit,
Okay.
unless somebody, before you do it, does anybody, well, they're not yet parliamentarians, if they ever will be, but maybe, Ambassador?
Reading is not to be taken in its literal context of picking the document up and reading it section by section. The parliamentarians do read them, and the reading doesn't take place there. In order to debate the legislation, you have to understand it, and to understand it, you have to read it. So the literal reading of the document by parliamentarians, by senators, takes place outside of the process of Parliament. The word reading, when used in the context of Parliament, really means presentation. So this is the first presentation of the bill, and this is the second presentation of the bill, and this is the third presentation of the bill. Not literally that you have to sit down and read it at that time. When you come to debate it, you have already read it in the literal context of the meaning of the word read. Have you ever been to Parliament?
No, but
May I take this opportunity, with the permission of the presiding officer of the Senate, with the President, to invite you to join us. I will contact you so that you can see and become more familiar with the process, because I do know that you have an interest in national issues, and I believe that there shouldn't be a mystery for you. Mr. President, with your permission, sir, when the Senate resumes its sittings, you will receive a formal invitation from us.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
However, let me clarify. Nothing goes out of our office until it's read 7 times. You read it once, you find errors, you read it again, less errors, read it again, less errors. I spend my time not going to Parliament physically, but virtually. The government has done a wonderful job of videoing and putting these things on YouTube. So that's why I can time what I timed, 2 seconds. I listen to the debates, because you won't see me in the nation at any of these parties, where others are. I'm spending my time reviewing bills that persons are trying to pass. And I listen to, let's say, the first debate, and I'm not listening to people dissecting anything. I'm hearing people talk about some cow in the pasture in their constituency, some road that they want done, as opposed to the actual bill that they're supposed to be discussing. We've recently had bills passed, like the Child Protection Bill, criminalizing parents for spanking children with fines of $100,000 and going to jail for 10 years. That's what they're liable for. Crazy stuff. So people are marching. I marched for the first time in my life against something. I marched for things before. This is the first time I marched against something because the bill was so bad. So it seems that people are not really reading these things as they should. And my recommendation is simply read it the first time, actually read it, and then read it actually, let us all hear you reading it the second time. And therefore, they will understand. They won't talk about the cows in their constituencies and potholes and that sort of thing. They can leave that for another time, but deal with the bill. And these are important bills. So, yeah, that's it.
I think there's a question that Dr. Chandler has to you, but I just want to revisit this again, because I think it is important that people understand the process, and I will share it from my experience of being in the Senate for 10 years. The first reading of the bill, first of all, before we get to the reading, and I can share with you.
Use the word presentation.
Yes, I'm going to move away from reading. Before a piece of legislation, and I would use the experience that I would have gone through, and I could have this verified by Mr. Lashley. Before a piece of legislation, a bill as it is called, before it becomes law, goes to Parliament, it has to come to Cabinet for approval. And in those 10 years, we had a subcommittee where before it even went to the Cabinet, it would have been discussed in that committee if we needed persons to come and explain to us, because sometimes you may get a piece of legislation that may be 50, 60 pages long. And you go through it to understand the issues, any technical issues. We would have brought in persons to, let's say it was legislation relating to building standards. I use something to which you can relate. Then we would have technical people come in and assist us, etc. By the time that committee says, okay, this legislation looks okay, we understand what it's all about, it goes back to Cabinet for approval. The Attorney General has to sign off on that legislation, saying that he or she agrees that it is fit for purpose. In other words, it is ready to go to Parliament. It goes to the House, and the notion of reading or presentation, the first reading is when it is introduced to the House. The second reading comes, and there is a debate. This is where people discuss the contents, etc. And that usually can take some time. Sometimes you have to adjourn and come back depending on the nature of it. The third reading would come once you have agreed, you've debated the piece of legislation. It has been agreed that it is, people have made their contributions and you're going to have this legislation come into being in the House of Assembly. And so that it is, you go into committee before you even after that second reading, and then you come back and finalize that. And the 2 seconds or whatever you had is when we have agreed that everything is fine, you've made your contributions, your debates, you understand the issues, and you think that this legislation is now ready for passing.
Yes.
And all of that is done. You say, I beg to move that it be read a third time.
Yes.
Not that we're going to sit down and read 50 pages. What we're saying is we will complete the process. And that third reading is part of the completion of the process. It is read a third time and cited as no longer a bill, but an act. And it is passed. So I think it is a little
No, I understand.
different of an interpretation, but I don't want to,
Yes.
to belabor the point. I think,
Yes, but I think that is still a weakness because of the quality of bills that have been coming out.
Okay.
You need
That is a-
to
that
actually
is a-
physically read it. I think that you need to read it before us all.
I think you're right.
But I
Okay,
think,
go ahead.
also, when
Ambassador.
the bill goes into committee, when the chamber goes into committee to review, you go through it section by section or part by part, clause by clause. And very often there is debate, disagreement, rejection, calls for amendment. So it is read, and very, very close attention is paid at the committee stage before you come back to your third reading. But it is a question of how you interpret the word reading, but I agree with our chair that we must move on.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Chandler. You wanted to raise a matter.
Chair, Brother Phillips, you indicated, if I heard you right, that you want to deal with the possibility of there being another parliament where there is no opposition. And you are suggesting that we should have 5 opposition seats, declared opposition seats. How would you, in your rearrangement of your parliament, set up such an arrangement? What is the structure you're looking for, and how do you see that making democracy what we are all hoping for?
Yes.
Sorry, can I add to that question, please, because it's a part 2. I think you explained it. I was trying to understand how the 5 would work if you didn't have, but I think you did explain. Sorry.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks, you did.
Yes.
Yeah,
So,
got it.
yes, if you have all 30 seats one by one, like how it is right now,
Yes.
you just look for the 5 willing, because they have to be willing, losing candidates with the most votes, and they are then selected, appointed.
Yes, I got that.
Right.
It was when you had other numbers. But
So that's how it works, and they're simply appointed. They don't represent constituencies. Therefore, they don't get funds for doing anything of the constituency. They don't compete.
I don't
and they
want to
don't,
detract from the Deputy Chair's question.
Yes, because they don't compete with those representatives in Parliament. So yes, the structure is simply dragging in 5 more seats at a 30-0, or 4 more seats at a 29-1, or 3 more seats in a 28-2, because in a 28-2, 28 will form the government, 2 will form the opposition. They're also representing their constituencies. Therefore, to reach 5, you need an additional 3. So you appoint 3 persons then. So you always get to this 5 number. There shouldn't be less than 5 opposition members to do the work of the opposition. We clearly saw that 2 didn't work. 3 is hard for them. So 5, I think, is adequate. And it shouldn't cost much, as I said, because you're not paying them to be representatives. Right. So I think it's a very efficient, elegant solution.
Dr. Phillips,
Yes.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I won't take up much more of your time because other people have to make presentations.
Yes.
But I just want to ask you, so first of all, I want to make a slight comment on the whole thing about the readings, just to say that I understand where you're coming from. And in the academic community and in the Commonwealth in general, practitioners, parliamentarians, etc., do speak about at least the separation of the periods of readings to give further consideration to bills. I understand what you're saying.
They rush it through in like a minute, all 3 sometimes.
I understand.
All three readings in 1 minute. Madness.
I fully understand. If we had more time, I would engage you on it. But to move on to this,
Yes.
to a topic that you, because you do have a party that almost became statistically significant in an election. From my political science hat, I recognize that.
Well, the proportional representation, we would have had 1 person.
Exactly,
so
right?
That's not almost. That is
exactly. Under proportional representation, you would have had a seat.
Yes.
So my question then is, 1, can you make a commentary, because it's funny you mentioned proportional representation and you would have had a seat under that system, but you do favor first past the post, which I think I understand why. I just want you to explain for the public why you prefer first past the post, since it came up in previous meetings. And the other thing is this, ISO, that was your mantra in one of the elections. And what I have still is, and what I've seen is that the Westminster Parliament and the entire government of the UK has adopted ISO wholesale, to the point that you have ISO for dates, ISO for emergency management for Parliament, ISO for normal meetings, ISO for quality management. So I know this is your topic. You brought this to the public forum. So I just want you to comment on it and what you think the utility of ISO standards would mean for Barbados.
Yes. First, the proportional representation. Having gone through 3 elections, there is something about going and just making your case to the people, and if they decide they want to go another way, that's quite okay. And that should be how the House should be, I think. I'm talking about the Senate. The Senate should be proportional representation, not the House. I think let the people elect their representatives. As far as ISO is concerned, I think the first government to actually do it was Singapore. So while they professionalized their public service, we went and politicized ours. The reason why MPs have to work so hard is because of the quality of management of public services. If they were well managed, you wouldn't have to work so hard. You wouldn't have to go pull your pocket. You wouldn't have to go looking for jobs for people, right? All that would be done. And that's what we offered. We offered quality management of public services. You shouldn't have to stand in line so long. You shouldn't have to deal with all the potholes, right? But if you go and vote for the pothole, well, don't complain about the pothole. So there is quality management can only improve Barbados. There's no downside. There's absolutely no downside. I offered to do it for free to the QEH. And we invited them, CEOs of every statutory corporation in Barbados, a commerce school. We went through the ISO system, we designed it for QEH, and not a single CEO showed up. Imagine that. So I do a lot of things around the region. I just can't get anything done. Even if I give it away in Barbados, they don't want it. So anyway, but hopefully we will implement ISO in Barbados. It's an international standard. Why anyone should criticize an international standard is beyond me. And it could, as I said, it can only benefit Barbados, it can only benefit every citizen, and it could only benefit politicians because, again, they don't have to work so hard.
Thank you very much. I invite another member of the audience to present. I see a hand over here. This gentleman, then the gentleman with the beard. And
Hi, good night. My name is Mario Taylor. Let me note disclaimer.
we need you to speak a little louder because we have an interpreter at the back signing. So
Hi, good night. My name is Mario Taylor. Disclaimer, I am a very lover of the Westminster model, and for me, the Parliament of Barbados should not be changed, but added with some level of flair. My first comment is when it comes to the estimates debate. I strongly disagree the way how the estimates debate is done in terms of the committee side, in terms of when the members bring the government employees in the well of the House. I don't think that we should have the government ministers in the well of the House. I think the committee system whereby you have a chairman of the Standing Finance Committee of the Senate and the chairman of the Standing Finance Committee of the House. So you would choose 5 members from the House, 5 members from the Senate, and when the 2 committees come together, you have the 2 chairmen will become co-chairs. So meaning, so the Senate would have 5 members, the House will have 5, and those members now would do the interrogation of the Standard Finance, not the Standard Finance, of the estimates in terms of the different ministries' budgets, still having the people come in the well of the House. I strongly believe that the well of the House should be only for 3 people, in terms of the clerks, parliamentarian, and ancillary staff. I don't think that nobody else should be in the House. My second submission is that when it comes to Steve Lashley and my brother said that you should appoint the speaker. In a situation, you could look at a situation whereby not appointing the speaker, but have a speaker whereby there's a rotation of speakers. Like for instance, like the American system whereby different days, different members will become the speaker of the House. And for instance, still have an afterwards sit the chair all day. He will sit the chair from 1 to 2, and then somebody else will come and rotate the senators in that system. Because I always believe that the House should always be a House whereby the House people are elected into the House and not appointed. It should never be appointed House, always elected. And thank you so much.
thank you very much.
I'm just, sorry.
I had indicated the gentleman with the...
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good night to everyone. Madam Chair,
Could you speak into the mic, please?
Madam Chair, my name is Wayne Naru Bakari. The purpose of this is really to make this presentation is to help to restore trust in our democracy and in our republic. I don't think that we could really build a strong republic if people are not participating. And therefore, to change it, we need to have opportunities for people to participate in areas where there's grounds or areas where mistrust could occur, as well as where people can manipulate the system with false news. There are 5 areas that I want to speak to briefly. The first one would be the the whole thing of question and answer time in Parliament. Now, this is a part of the Westminster system, but yet it is not fully used or effectively used in our Parliament. I feel that I am of the opinion that the public should have an opportunity to pose questions to the parliamentarians, to the Prime Minister, and to any member of Parliament. This could be done by submitting questions to the person in charge of Parliament. I think that it could also be done by allowing the constituents' representative to pose the questions for the individual, or the individual should be able to make the presentation themselves. It could be done also by groups or by businesses, whatever, but the opportunity should be given for people to be able to pose questions, and a time period should be given on which those questions should be answered. Probably no later than 3 months, the maximum. In areas where they need to be researched, they should be, the Clerk of Parliament could determine that time, but not later than 6 months. That was the first one. The second one is the reporting in the well of Parliament. I think this is a very good idea, where you allow the civil servants as well as the person in charge of that ministry to come into the Parliament and to be able to answer questions to the efficiency of their ministries or the lack thereof. Because we vote a whole lot of money to various ministries or various departments, but I'm not quite sure that we are given enough information on how that money is being spent and whether or not there's high levels of wastage and so forth. So in an effort to improve the management of the various ministries, people must be held accountable and know that they are being held accountable by the public. And this is something, to me, that should be made a permanent part of our Parliament. The other area is the Public Accounts Committee. I think that the Public Accounts Committee should not be languishing right now, or should never be languishing. I think it's too important a committee to be left. So therefore, if there's not an opposition leader, then an independent senator should be appointed by the President to be able to chair that committee, with the assistance of the Auditor General to raise issues of national importance, and those issues must be dealt with. People must be held accountable to appearing. If for one reason people keep putting it off, I think that I think that is already in the position where people should be fined or placed in a position where they could be, held accountable in those areas. I think that we should be able to use the technology that if people cannot attend physically, they could attend virtually, and therefore there should not be a delay. But if there continue to be a delay, if they don't have a forum as a result of the delay, the issue should still continue to be discussed or dealt with, and it should be televised so that the public would know that the issues are being addressed. The other area that I want to speak to is the treatment of the office of Prime Minister. I think in our democracy, I think it's important that we restore trust and confidence and respect to the office, to the various offices in our country. I think that when there's a lack of trust and respect for those offices, we are weakening our democracy. And a lot of our young people are not encouraged to respect the various offices that are established in our country. So therefore, I'm suggesting that the position of Prime Minister and the office of Prime Minister, when that person vacates that office, I don't think that that person should be allowed to fall on hard times. I don't think that they should be treated in a way that, as Barbadians, we like to get back at people, so let the person, we have this saying, they should know their place and keep them in the dumps. I think that the former Prime Minister should be given a proper allowance, a maintained allowance, so that he does not or she does not fall below a certain living standard. They should have a car at their disposal, and they should be formally invited in a proper time to functions, national functions and national things, so that that office must always be held, and those persons holding that office must be held in high esteem. I think that is important that that person be given some secretarial assistance so that their memoirs could be recorded. I think too often many of our leaders depart that office without leaving their memoirs. And I think it's important in terms of strengthening our republic as we go forward, that there be some history there, some experience, some practical experience that other people could learn from, and to be able to improve on the efficiency of that office. The area of their memoirs is very, very important. The last point that I want to speak to is the whole thing of where there's a situation where you have one party winning all seats. I really believe that there should be some accommodation for those persons that did not or does not support the government, be given some position in the Senate that they could speak for the percentage of persons that does not support the government, so that their issues and their areas of concern could be heard. I don't think it is good enough that you have, say, 40% of persons in the country that does not support the government not being properly heard, and they are being heard from outside of the Parliament. I think that that is something that I would like to see corrected. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we will take this next presentation, and then we will go to the videotape presentations from Mr. Wickham, and then we will come back to the audience. Yes, sir.
I'm going to be really quick. I'm just going to say thank you for your Grenville Phillips Free's recommendation about the ISO, because the standard that he talks about, because you may hear that my accent's very English. I was brought up in England. My parents were born in Barbados. So were my great-grandparents, and so were my great-great-grandparents. So as a guy living in England, I always thought Barbados was the greatest thing up until I came to live here. I've been living here 13 years, and like the engineer, Mr. Phillips said, about the standards, I mean, the standards are very poor, because, I mean, if you look at the Minister of Transport, whoever that person is, you have a zebra crossing with the zebra crossing sign on the zebra crossing. The driver who approaches it does not see the zebra crossing, especially if he is an international driver, until he's on the crossing. I would suggest that, you know, if we're talking about expertise, that if you could have the sign 50 yards up, so that when the driver's approaching the sign, they could see that in the next 20 yards or 10 yards, we're going to come onto a zebra crossing. Now, I think these are very small, common, sensual things that we seem to be missing. I saw the reform on the highway, where we had the highway smoothened out. We smoothened out the smoothest road on the island. And not only did we smoothen out the smoothest road on the island, we lit it very well and put reflectors on it. Now, you don't put reflectors on a road that's lit. Do you understand? And as far as the parliamentary reform, I heard the youngster said that he respected the Westminster parliamentary system. Well, you know, I lived under it and I don't. I think it's about time that, you know, as a country, we should have our own rule. When I say our own rule, I mean, take for instance this. We live in Barbados and most adults look at their children and say, "Want to speak properly?" So the fact that you're telling your children that means that you see in your mind that you're inferior to someone else. We also have to go along with the schooling system, which the colonial master put in, and we have to have our children beg, can we have a 11 plus off you? Can we have a CXC off you? When are we going to get to the point where we as colonized people be able to ratify ourselves? Why do we need the colonizer to ratify us in our own country? So when it comes to parliamentary reform, the reform that I would like to see is where we govern ourselves without having to look at the World Economic Forum, the World Health Authority, the IMF to govern our country. Because when we talk about independent, the word independent means self-sustaining. So if you're relying on someone for governance, that means we're not independent. So that's all I got to say.
Thank you very much. My only response to you is that...
One more quick one. One more quick one. Yeah, because we cannot let the colonizer keep brainwashing us. And let me show you how we're brainwashed. The colonizer is going to tell us hair, and he's going to spell it H-A-I-R, but he's still going to have hair, H-E-A-R, and he's going to have hair, H. Can you see that the colonizer has been trying to confuse us with all of that elocution that I hear you speaking tonight? I was watching the news and I heard one of your ministers say, "Oh, well, the pedagogical system of Barbados is fantastic." I was born in the UK and never heard that word. So that means most of the people who were watching CBC that night didn't know what that word meant. So I'm saying that if you really want to communicate with the listeners, you've got to say educational instead of pedagogical, because when you think that you're using elocution and you think that you sound clever, you don't sound clever to international people, because when you live in an oppressive society, we don't speak. When we go to school and we come out of our English class, all the children of color, we speak our normal talk. We speak English Bajan, Katishan Bajan, Montserrat Bajan, English, Vincentian English, Katishan English, because we're not trying to mimic the colonizer. Whereas here, where we don't have to speak English because we all understand Bajan, we're like mimicking the colonizer, and it's very heart-wrenching to see. I mean, we were the first, the Constitution that said that a black person was 3/5 of a human was written here in Barbados. And I would say that here in Barbados, we might well be 3/5 of a human, because when we need the colonizer to ratify anything that we do, we can't be a full human. So that's why when I talk about parliamentary reform, I'd like the whole thing scrapped and a new system come in that benefits the people of our country. That's what I would like to see.
Okay, thank you very much. And in the interest of time, I would simply just say that many of us are happy to be bilingual in terms of being able to speak Bajan and English, because we also have to engage the rest of the world beyond the colonizer. On that note, no, I'm sorry, sir. On that note, we will take the video presentations from Mr. Peter Wickham, and then we will go back to the audience. I'm very conscious of time, I'm sorry. And are they ready? Okay, so we'll have Mr. Wickham's contribution.
Yeah, in terms of pensions, this is a very sensitive issue, and one that I also think needs to be guided by certain principles. And the first one here is that parliamentarians have far less security than any other type of employee and ought to be treated accordingly. The security of tenure that the average person has, that would ensure that they would be able to keep their job, and indeed if they lose their job, they get the opportunity to go before the Employment Rights Tribunal, does not apply to parliamentarians. And I think that this is a consideration and a concern that has to be considered. In that that environment, politicians are far more volatile, and as a result, they're not comparable to the average employee, and this is the reason why their pensions ought to be different. The second point is that the vast majority of parliamentarians will serve for 2 terms, or will be able to serve for 2 terms by virtue of the fact that they're elected and then they're re-elected. The outliers are persons that serve for 5 or 6, or alternatively, persons that serve for 1. My feeling is that whatever the parliamentary pension consideration is, it should reach the vast majority as opposed to the outliers. So the idea of setting the bar higher where persons have to serve for 3 or 4 terms, or alternatively set it lower where a person serves for 1, I think should not be the approach. I think the current approach of setting it where the vast majority, and the statistics reveal that the vast majority of persons who serve in Parliament usually do get re-elected at least once, and on that basis, I think that that's a reasonable starting point. The question of the years, currently it is 2 terms, and I think that once the Prime Minister retains the capacity to call an election at any time of his or her choosing, then the reasonable presumption is that even a short term should carry the same qualification as a long term. If we get to a stage in Barbados where we take that power away from the Prime Minister, then certainly we can say that the pension is based on the service of terms of a length of 5 years or something of that nature. The third point is that parliamentarians, generally speaking, have a second professional life. So usually when you come into Parliament, you're doing something before, and then when you leave Parliament, you can continue to do that, do something. So the idea of being a member of Parliament is not the final limit of their employment, and I think that this is also an important point that we should consider. So against that background, what do I think in terms of the pensions? I do not think that the current age of 50 is one that should stand. I do think that it should increase. At the same time, I'm not convinced it should increase to 68 because while a person who is a member of Parliament or run as a member of Parliament can technically speaking run until they're not able to run, while the idea of 68 is a mandatory retirement age for persons in other categories. I like 65 or alternatively even 60, but I do think it should be substantially higher than 50, and I think that that also speaks to the issues that I raised. A couple of other things come up in that whole question of pensions, who qualifies for pension. Persons who receive salaries, like the President of the Senate, persons who are members of Parliament and so on, qualify for pensions. Senators, however, get a stipend and they do not qualify for pensions. And I think that that is an entirely reasonable position because if we classify a stipend, then there's no basis on which you can argue that that person who receives a stipend should be qualifying for a pension, while a person who is receiving a salary, then that person is reasonably qualified for such. And I think the current principle where the Speaker of the House and the President of the Senate, persons like that definitely do qualify, while the actual senators who essentially serve 1 day a week and usually are in another capacity is entirely reasonable. So that's my view on the pensions. I support the idea of the age increasing. I think it is good in this conversation that we're having currently to create some level of equity, even though we're not saying we're going completely to 68. The idea of them moving to a higher level, I think, is only fair and reasonable. The qualifying bar should remain the same, but the age at which that person can access the funds, my sense is that it ought to be later. Thank you.
There are, I think, 3 issues on which you spoke, so we will take them all together, and then I will go to you, sir, after.
Hi, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and good afternoon, members of the Parliament. Very much the opportunity to share with you some thoughts on this issue of the terms and conditions of service of pensions of parliamentarians using the wonders of technology that are available to us. I won't keep you too long, so I'll get right to the point. I think that there's some underlying principles that we need to take into consideration when we look at the question of remuneration of parliamentarians. The first one is that they are paid to do a job that is very important. There was a time in the history of mankind when persons who represented people in Parliament would have been landowners and other wealthy persons, and as a result, they were not necessarily paid for their time because ultimately they were representing their interests. We have moved past that now, and the idea is that persons who are members of Parliament represent your interests or the interests of the public, and as a result, they ought to be paid. So I think that we need to agree as a starting point that if people are working for us, they ought to be paid properly to work for us. The second thing is that the task is not a voluntary one in which they should give all of their earnings to constituents. And I think this is also linked to the first point, that if we agree that persons are working and doing a job, the idea is that you should not expect that the person who is a member of Parliament should earn a salary and essentially just divide it up among constituents that they're closest to. MPs are like anyone else, and I think as like anyone else, they deserve to earn a decent living. They deserve to be able to pay their mortgage, to be able to send their children to school, because ultimately they have the same kinds of concerns and needs as the rest of us, and ought to be paid appropriately in that regard. I think another principle is that, they say in life, if you pay peanuts, you get monkeys. And ultimately, if we want people to work properly for us, people who are qualified, people who have something to offer, we need to pay them properly. I've done some research on women in politics, and I find that one of the things that distracts or deters professional women, and the reality is that the majority of people coming out of the University of the West Indies annually usually are women. Women number more lawyers and doctors and so on. And many of these persons would be ideal for politics, but prefer to stay in their own lane because they are paid better for what they do than they will be paid as politicians, and that is a sad reality. I think that if we're going to look at attracting the brightest and the best, then we need to be able to pay them appropriately and comparatively. Whether persons are MPs or ministers, they guide the award of major investments and spending. And they're somewhat like judges in that if a person is able to influence a person who is an MP or a minister, ultimately you essentially create the basis for corruption. I do feel that we need to pay people well enough to ensure that they cannot be easily bought. I appreciate that there are limitations to this, but ultimately this is a principle I think that we also ought to observe. Another principle is that salaries ought to be comparable to senior management in either the private sector or government, one or the other, or even both. This is something that requires assessment, where you can do a survey of the salaries and wages of persons in senior management to see how this can be done. There is a misconception that can easily be considered where there are so many persons who work and are paid from the public purse that are paid so much better than prime ministers. So the head of tourism authority in Barbados is paid better than the prime minister. The central bank governor is paid better than the prime minister. The principal of UWI, the head of the Caribbean Development Bank, the CARICOM Secretary General, these types of people are ultimately paid by the public purse. They're paid far better than the prime minister is paid. And I think that in terms of looking at not only them, but persons at ministerial level, that is something that ought to be given consideration. If we look at what ministers are paid compared to what, let's say, someone like a senior lecturer at the University of West Indies is paid, is comparable. And I think that this is the kind of analysis that needs to be done on an ongoing basis. I have a problem with the fact that we have a situation in Barbados where MPs and essentially parliamentarians set their own salaries. I appreciate that the point that Erskine Sanford always made, that politicians are the highest form of public servant, and as a result, if you increase public servant salaries, you ought to increase parliamentarian salaries, is a reasonable one. I don't have a difficulty with it, but I do feel it offends natural justice that you have persons setting their own salaries and wages, because ultimately you have individuals being judges in their own cause. I think that we can do better, and as a result, I will make a suggestion shortly where that is concerned. The entirety of MPs' work is something that we also need to consider. Basically, MPs versus ministers. Ministers are not paid twice. even though the reality is that a lot of times they do the constituents work as well as the ministerial work. And I'm not suggesting that they should be paid twice, but I do think that the idea of staffing, and I said this in the last contribution, ought to reflect the fact that from time to time, persons may have to have constituency staff to support that work, and then also staffing at the level of the ministerial office, and I think that that can help in that regard. So, the most important issue then is how do you consider all of these principles in terms of getting the Parliamentary Reform Commission to consider an alternative mechanism for determining salaries and wages. My personal feeling is that there ought to be a Parliamentary Review Salaries and Wages Commission, or some type of title that reflects the fact you have a permanent commission to review salaries and wages and to make concrete recommendations. This is the type of approach that's taken in the United Kingdom, and I'm not saying we need to carbon copy it, but certainly I think we need to.
While we figure out if there was a third one, I'll invite this gentleman to the podium. Well, yes. Yeah.
Thank you, Chair and members of the committee. And before I make my short presentation, I want to thank Mr. Lashley and Mr. Greenidge for their contribution to tonight's debate. And I want to put what I am saying in writing to the committee, but just to highlight the importance of it. Barbadians need to prepare ourselves, and that is why this committee is so very important. It is not a coincidence that we, according to Mr. Phillips, have a one-party state. It's not a coincidence. In 4 years' time, Barbados will be commemorating its 400th anniversary of colonization. So this process that we are going through is to prepare Barbados for what is coming. And that is why Barbados is presently in the leadership of the world as far as ideas is coming and things are happening in Barbados. It is not a coincidence. And there's 2 points that Barbadians need to consider. If you are going to retain the parliamentary system of parties, parties must become legal entities of Parliament, which at present they are not. And I make that point because at this moment, the government is in court for denying persons from casting their vote. The parliamentary system that we have inherited from 1966 was classist and discriminatory. What needs to change? And as Mr. Greenidge said, people see parliamentarians or remember parliamentarians for the last favor they did. Yesterday I was introducing to my group at the beach what I am going to present to you is mandatory voting. You see, parliamentarians, or we as Barbadians came up with parliamentarians or people standing for parliament buying votes. None of us can deny that. Favors, do me one favor. And discriminatory, where the illiterate person are not permitted to vote without this letting people know that they can't read or write. And therefore, they are discriminated because the acronyms on the political party is not there that a person who can read and write can put their name. Secondly, I do not understand how we have a parliamentary system that the cabinet of Barbados agree that what was done to an individual was wrong, talking about retroactive payment, and the cabinet passed to say pay the person. In 2010, and in 2019, all this is in writing. We have that. We will look into it. Government is going to look into the fact that cabinet passed a decision to pay the person. I do not understand how a parliament can do that. So therefore, I support the recommendation that there must be a Minister of Justice, or as I recommended to the last meeting, sorry, the last Reform Committee, not Reform, Constitutional Reform Committee, that there should be a commission for human rights. You see, in Barbados, over the last 396 years, black people's human rights have been violated. There's no question about it. And I close on this. In 1963, the government of Barbados assisted me to go to England. The government of Barbados would have known the racism that I was going to face in Barbados, in England. They did not inform us. And we walked straight into the lion's den. And thousands of Barbadians and other Caribbean nationals, human rights were violated. And I took when it happened to me, I took the opportunity and challenged the system. And today, my case in Britain, 46 years, and I am suing the British government in a way that we need to prepare ourselves for if we are going to receive what is due to us. I'm talking about reparatory justice or reparations. Take a note from my case that has been in the British High Court for the last 46 years that is about to come to an end, hopefully this year. I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Laria. And I think there were three submissions from Mr. Wickham. We'll have that, and then I think this gentleman wanted to, and we may very well have to start looking at wrapping up, I think.
Yeah, in light of the comments that was made last week by Bobby Morris, I just wanted to make a quick comment in relation to the number of seats that we currently have, since that relates to a lot of the work I do as a psephologist, not only in Barbados but across the region. The question of 30 seats, the magical number, and one of the issues that you have to consider as a commission is whether it should be higher or lower. And I do agree that it ought to be reflective of an odd number, which would certainly make life a lot easier. So perhaps the number can be either increased or dropped. Personally, I would prefer the number to be dropped because I don't know that the idea of 30 is absolutely necessary. But to me, this undergirds a larger issue, which is the question of how do we determine the number of persons at the seats in Barbados. There was a time when we had a certain number of parishes, which is 11, and we said we'll have 22 persons in Parliament because you have 2 for every parish. You had double member constituencies. We have moved beyond that to a principle now where Parliament can set a number based on Parliament's choosing at any point in time. I'm uncomfortable with this because what we have done historically for ease is whenever we have had an expansion in places like St. Philip, St. Thomas, St. James, what we have done is we have just added constituencies. So in St. Thomas, the most recent ones that we added would have been in St. Philip. So we added a constituency in St. Philip. And essentially what we have done in many instances is that we give the opposition one, and give government one, so that it appears to be equitable and fair. And this is the reason that we've been able to increase the number of seats so steadily. So on the last occasion, we created an additional seat. The Christchurch South, I believe, would have been the one that at the time was slightly inclined towards the Barbados Labour Party. And then, of course, the St. Philip seats were DLP strongholds, so that would be an additional seat for the Dems. And as a result, there's a parity. I think that we've come to a stage now where we need to be more mature and we cannot continue expanding exponentially. I would like for us to constitutionally fix the number of seats at an odd number, and it would force us to consider mechanisms to reallocate individual seats in terms of the numbers of people to create that equity, because as it stands now, some are above, some are below. We have constituencies like Bridgetown, St. John, St. Andrews, St. Lucie that are consistently falling below because persons are not moving into those constituencies. The question is, what do we do with them? I appreciate that there is not a fertile conversation for removing constituencies like Bridgetown. My sense is that if we're going to maintain them, then we have to be in a position to consider changing the names of constituencies or amending them as time passes to reflect the geographical reality that they serve. So St. John and Northern St. Philip may very well have to become a reality if St. John continues to contract the way it is contracting. Bridgetown may very well become Greater Bridgetown because they will have to take into consideration areas that are outside of central Bridgetown to accommodate again the reality that in order to reach the average number, you need to necessarily, focus more people in that area. So I think that may be one of the ways we can deal with it. So my thing is, one, constitutionally fix the number, and secondly, have the idea of reallocating numbers within constituencies, as is done in the United States of America, where you routinely move the boundaries to accommodate population changes and flows. You have the mechanisms to do that, which have to be fair and equitable, of course, but the idea is that we will stick to a set number that is set by the Constitution of Barbados. So that would require a constitutional amendment. And my feeling is that if we went ahead and we made it now by not adding a seat but dropping a seat, which is a lot easier to do in a situation where one party holds all the seats. If we drop the seat now, then we could start that principle of working towards having a continual equity as time passes. So those are my comments, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. Hopefully I did not take up too much of your time. Thanks.
Well, we will certainly thank Mr. Wickham for that, and we will have one other contribution from the floor, and then we will hear from Sir Roy.
Good night to the panel. Good night, audience. My name is Chapman Rice. I'm a PhD candidate with Salisis Mona, and my thesis is critically examining how can local government, through the field of participatory development communication, can aid local development at the constituency level. Now, I paid acute attention to what the former parliamentarian said in terms of the workload, and I proposed to the panel that local government is that infrastructure and system that can facilitate and ease the burden of the parliamentarian. So the constituency councils was a good idea. However, it was manned by the wrong persons. You can't just expect someone in the neighborhood to understand what is local development. So that was the misconception. That was one of the errors made, where you just take almost anybody and place on the council. And I have done a critical analysis of the Thorne Commission's report. And based from that document, so for example, their method of communicating with the public, and this was a problem within the constituency councils, there was a disparity between the ideas flowing up from the constituency level to the council, whereby their voices can be heard and plans can be developed. So I support Mr. Lashley's suggestion of community development plans, but the critical point is how. So for example, this town hall meeting in this area, look at the size of the audience. So participatory development communication is a methodology which looks at going into the community, going in the areas where they line the shops, and actually with guidance and assistance, allowing the representatives to say to the reps or the members what they want to see. And the interesting thing about it, it moves from just talking to participation. So it's not that they are actually saying we want this and then we just go away and the government conceptualizes. It's a situation where they're actually involved in the formulation and execution of the actual activity they want to see implemented. And what this will do, it will take some time because a cultural education and activity aspect. What this will do, this will move the mental framework of the residents in the area actually just coming to the MP, I want this done, versus you together as a community can come together, the government, so let me take for example, I want to road, but an activity whereby persons who actually want to see this specific activity implemented, the government just facilitates. And the community residents actively are involved in what they wanted to see, for example, birthed from a community development plan. So it will take some years, but slowly you will see persons not having this mentality of running initially to the MP, but there will be a mechanism of framework within the local government in every constituency that this is what we want to see happen, and this is how, not just vocalizing what it is we want to see, but there is active participation, and this will facilitate the public not feeling that we only have a say every 5 years. So I conclude with that recommendation.
Well, thank you very much, and I would invite you perhaps maybe to even submit a written position on what you just contributed.
Sure, no problem.
Thank you very much. So I will now invite Sir Roy to share with us.
Thank you very much, Chair, and good evening to all of you physically here and virtually. My task was supposed to be a standby to assist my two friends, Stephen and Cappy, in the event that they had got too modest and did not want to be as openly expressive of the interests and concerns of parliamentarians as there have been. I would like to say words to you, but I believe I would be stealing from Ambassador Thompson if I did that, because she has the last word, and I would not take too much in terms of speaking about what you were referring to. But I would wish to say to those of you who are here and those who are not here but are hearing, that part of what this committee wanted to do was to be sure that you became sufficiently stimulated in your thinking about this subject, that you realize that your task was not to come and merely to hear a presentation by one or two people, and the presentations were good presentations, thank you very much, but that you had to be sure that you understood what our task is, be able to understand who we are as a people, what we are trying to do now that we are into another phase of our development as a people, and to ask ourselves whether within this system, this commission is going to get the full benefit of your clear and unfettered opinion regarding what Parliament is, what Parliament should be, how parliamentarians should be treated, how parliamentarians should be empowered to be treated, and if you think they're too well taken care of, say so. But if you have heard what the others have said today, and you look around you, then you have to ask yourself the question. If I compare what my parliamentarians are supposed to do and what the parliamentarians do, am I satisfied with what they're doing, or do I want more from them? And if I engage them, am I treating them sufficiently equitably compared with how other similar leaders and hardworking people are treated? Well, we thought that the only way you could properly understand that is by having some idea as to the work they do, hence Cappy and Stephen's presentations, but that you should also be able to ask yourselves what it is that parliamentarians receive as terms of reference or job conditions. And we did not know if you knew, but we thought we would throw it out there for you so you would understand that parliamentarians don't receive sick leave. Benefit, you get sick leave, but you don't get the benefit, sick leave benefit. And I was a union leader, and I offered to organize them, and Dame Miller indicated that she wanted to be president of the group, but the others did not get organized, so I was not able to give them proper support at that time. But no sick leave, no vacation leave, and you know, we have a law that says that if you don't take your vacation when it is due, then you're in violation of the laws of Barbados. So parliamentarians still must understand that I am able, as a retired person, to give them that representation. When they retire, the feeling is that they get national insurance pension, and they also get a pension that they don't contribute to. But in fact, their pension is a contributory pension. A lot has been raised and asked about whether it should be at 50 or more than 50. And you have to recognize and to answer the question yourself, because our task is not to tell you. Our task is to ask you to think about it and to give us your honest-to-goodness answers. When a parliamentarian does 15 years, and he has worked as a parliamentarian for those 15 years, are those 15 years, in your view, not years that are stressful to the extent that you have to see them somewhat differently from somebody who works for an employer, but where the employer has the responsibility of the office? There are responsible for doing it right first time, and if they get it wrong, then they pay the full penalty with the vote, or they should. That is the way it works. So the question that we have to ask ourselves is, given the stressful nature of the job, given the conditions of the job, given the fact that what you thought were benefits are benefits that people dream about but that parliamentarians don't get, is it not worth your considering what you yourself would want if you had the opportunity, as you have now, to put on the table a list of the wage levels or salary levels, a list of the conditions that are required that you would like to put there, and you might want to put in a duty free car, but nobody's asking for that, as I see, but the public thinks that there is that. And they think the same thing about trade union leaders, by the way, but nobody who serves in these jobs is able to come and tell the public the truth, because it looks as though you're blowing your own trumpet. So the parliamentarian isn't going to tell you that as a backbencher, he or she gets less than $6,000 a month. The parliamentarian who is a minister isn't going to tell you that he gets just about what a permanent secretary gets, except that the permanent secretary doesn't have constituents for whom he has to be father, godfather, and surrogate father. Nor do you fully understand that our leader of the country, though you might say that the leader gets an awful lot of money, the leader of the country does not get $300,000 a year. But that's the leader of the country. And there are people who are playing sports in some areas for whom that is a sneeze. We don't want to put out figures out there to scare anybody or to believe that this commission is here to look at building salaries for anybody. But we think that if we are going to correct our parliamentary systems, and if we are going to make parliamentarians more answerable to the public, we have to make more demands on them than we do now in our commission's report. But we have to make sure that our report shows the shortfalls and the shortcomings that exist at the moment as we speak. And so we want it to be clear that you can only speak properly on the issue if you know the facts. A lot is said about senators as another example, but do you know that the person who serves as a senator gets an allowance of $1,500? You don't get a salary, you don't call it a salary. But what do you think the Senate does? And if it doesn't do what you want it to do, then you, as the public of Barbados, need to give us information that would make us recommend that the Senate does more of what you want. But by the same token, you have to empower that Senate as you have to empower that Parliament, and $1,500 doesn't cut it. Then you have to think of many other things that we as citizens of Barbados need our country to have done. And you have to ask who it is that you want to do it. And if the parliamentarians are the people you know should do it, we want your views, we want them clear, and we want them in such a way that there is no possibility for misunderstanding where we are or where we need to go. And that is why we thought in this session to ask two parliamentarians to come. We did not coach them, but as they kept speaking, I recognize that I did not have to tell you this or tell you that, because both of them spoke so lucidly about the shortcomings in our system as it comes to the way that as employers we treat our servants. And our parliamentarians, like other servers of the public, are our servants. But we have to treat those who serve us with the respect that is due to them. I think I should stop here because it is the time of day when you don't want to hear another sermon.
Thank you so much, Sir Roy, for further clarifying the terms and conditions. And before I go to Ambassador Thompson for closing remarks, I just want to say to the 350 persons or so who are with us online, thank you very much. And I hope that we will continue to have the level of interest shown in these presentations. For our last two meetings, we had an average of 300 persons online, and in getting the statistics, we saw that since the previous two meetings, there were 7,525 views. So clearly, Barbadians at home, abroad, and others are following these discussions. And we commit to ensuring that we capture the comments and suggestions made online. And with those comments, over to you, Ambassador.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. Well, my task is easy. It is really just to say thank you to everyone, but before I do so, please may I recognize the Honorable Sandra Husbands, who joined us later as the evening progressed, as well as to recognize Khalil Kofdawala, who is a commissioner on the Constitutional Reform Commission. I'm aware too that Sir Christopher Blackman, the chairman of the CRC, is following the discussion online. So thank you very much for joining us. I want to speak, first of all, to our distinguished guest speakers. There was no debate this evening. There was a lot of convergence between the two parties, or the perspectives of the two parties, or the two former parliamentarians and ministers. And we deliberately chose politicians who are not active and were not on the executives or sitting in Parliament at this time, because we wanted to choose people whom we felt had some distance from the political fray, but would equally be recognized as having been associated with the two major political parties. So thank you both for so readily accepting our invitation and for making what I think were I will adopt the word lucid presentations, which really I think took the public some distance in helping to understand the myriad roles, and that was the word used by Mr. Lashley, the myriad roles performed by members of Parliament. Mr. Peter Wickham, political scientist, is currently out of the country, but was kind enough to indicate that he would intervene, and he did so via the technology. We are grateful that we had that capacity, and therefore we thank him for his comments. We would want to thank as well the school board and school staff for making the hall available and helping us with all of the facilities that you see this evening, and indeed with the setup. Our chair has already indicated that the online presence grew to 362 when last we checked, and 7,825 people having reviewed 7,825 views, so having reviewed the meetings, the last two town halls, which I think is indicative of an interest, and I want to thank all of you who took the time to come out here this evening. I know some of you are coming from some distance away. You are not all Filipinos, and therefore thank you for your presence. We urge your continued interest in this important national matter. I recognize that there are a couple faces in the audience who have been to every town hall meeting so far. Our next one is at Alexandra's. Alexandra's next week, Thursday at 7 p.m. You're going to say, what are we going to be discussing? Have we set it? We would advertise. So we are going to keep you a mystery and advertise starting tomorrow for the next town hall. But please note, next Thursday night at 7 o'clock at the Alexandra School, we go to the north. You know, we had our first meeting at the BWU. We went then to Foundation. We've come south, and now we are going north. I want to thank in particular the Clerk of Parliament and his staff. The Clerk of Parliament is the secretary to the Commission. He gives us excellent support, as does his staff. And there are several members of them here tonight at the back of the room and outside to continue supporting the work of the Commission. We could not do it without them. Every challenge we encounter, they support us, and in fact, they facilitate every request that we have made. You are seeing these presentations, but really we are meeting as well every Monday, and we are engaging with entities like the Electoral and Boundaries Commission and other presenters from the university and so on, and all of that is facilitated by the clerk and his team. That brings me to the end of our formal vote of thanks, and just to wish you a safe drive home and God's blessings as you journey onward. Thank you very much.